Hello, everyone, and welcome to Training Unleashed. Before we get started, on behalf of the Learning Network, I want to thank all of our listeners for being here. I also want to thank our sponsors, C-Suite TV and C-Suite Radio. Without you, we wouldn't have a show. I've got a great guest. Her name is Marie Deveaux, and she is the founder of High Tide Consulting. And today we're going to be talking a lot about diversity, equity, inclusion. Before we go, I'm going to go on a personal rant, which I don't normally do on a show. But DE&I has nothing to do with affirmative action. It is literally about how to make companies better and not about quotas or quota systems. So let me just start off with the first question, which I'll make a simple question. Why do people get confused with affirmative action in DE&I? And why is that so hurtful to DE&I efforts?
Yeah. First, thank you for having me. And I think that was probably the shortest rant I've ever heard. I just so appreciate your concision. But I think what people get mixed up around DEI, I think that reason is largely because DEI, if we really look at the origins of the civil rights movement, where a lot of these um, kind of asks for fair treatment come from, at least in the United States context, that comes out of the 1960s. And so DEI really began as a way for employers to start looking at, well, how do we incorporate some of what's happening socially in the rest of the world into the workplace so that people also feel fairly treated? That is it in terms of DEI. That is what we're looking at. How can we make sure more people can participate fully in the workplace?
Is diverse workplaces produce better work? And it's not about it's a good social thing to do. It is
No.
literally economically proven that companies that have diverse, equitable, and inclusive workplaces outperform sales growth and profitability than companies that don't.
That is 100% true. And there's lots of data and lots of papers to support that. Companies who get more people to work together do better
Yeah.
in every metric, like full stop. And once companies started to recognize that, they made even more concerted efforts towards having DEI programming initiatives, departments, people who are really tasked with the job of focusing on this area. How do we get more people in our doors, staying in our companies, engaged, and how do we get the most out of the people that we have? So yes, that's absolutely true. I think where people sometimes confuse the issue is because they look like affirmative action, which affirmative action was, in my view, affirmative action was a way of providing some form of reparations for people who had not had as much access to higher education. That is how affirmative action.
In its time was extremely important.
Mhm.
I think less important now. I wouldn't say not important now, but a totally different issue.
Yes, very, very different. Now, again, if we look at where we were in the 1960s or even before that, before Brown versus Board of Education, we're talking about segregation. We're talking about really denying access to people based on race. That is not where we are now in the United States. And so people will look at the case of affirmative action and say, well, that's DEI, which is not true. Does and did affirmative action try to provide more equitable access to people in terms of college? Yes, but that is not what we're talking about when we talk about DEI in the workplace, right? We are talking about how can we get the full diversity of people that come to work to provide their best and to support the company in a way that we can get more people working together towards common goals. That's what we're talking about.
Yeah. It's interesting because I live in Boston and we have Harvard here in Boston. And since the Supreme Court ruled against affirmative action in terms of their enrollment, there's been a shift in the enrollment. And in the surveying of the students and the evaluation of the students, the quality of education has gone down. In theory, they chose people that were academically the most superior class, but without the diversity of backgrounds and ideas, they lost some of the richness in the conversation and in the learning,
Right.
which I think is interesting. So
Yeah.
one of the things I really liked when I read about you and learned about you is a lot of people focus on the D and the E, and
Mhm.
you really focus on the inclusion and communication side,
Yeah,
which is something that every company, if you ignore the D and E, the I is a super important part of the conversation. Can
right.
you tell us a little bit about that and then how companies create companies that are focusing on the inclusion part?
Yeah. Well, I think to your point, I think we don't have to worry about diversity because diversity is always present when two or more people are present. Humans are infinitely different and diverse from each other all of the time. That's going to happen really kind of naturally. So I tell people to focus on inclusion. And the reason I focus on inclusion is because it's about then the actions we take to get more perspectives into the dialogue. And that is the thing that we actually have the most control over when we're thinking about the workplace of who is speaking, who's being listened to, what does the feedback culture look like, and how are people getting ideas expressed, and how are those ideas being integrated into work streams. And that all of that is inclusion. And that is the large part of where we see the most gains when we talk about DEI in the workplace is diversity of thought, those ideas getting heard, and then those ideas actually turning into new policy, new practices, new services, new products. That's where we get the most bang for our buck is when diversity of ideas actually result in outcomes and deliverables for the company.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is it's really hearing from a lot of different people and having a diversity of ideas. And would you say that is not just at the corporate rank, but throughout the whole company?
Oh, that's absolutely at the whole throughout the whole company. And I'm a firm believer that everyone can make change from where they are. So sometimes I hear people asking about, well, what do leaders need to do? What do leaders need to do? And I remind people, leader doesn't always come with a C in front of your title, right? Everyone has capacity to lead. You can lead from the middle. And that's really important because oftentimes that's where we have the majority of workers are in that middle band of employees on their org chart. And so thinking about not just for those who are in C-suite positions or who are running departments, but really for those middle managers, there's also tremendous opportunity to use inclusion as a way to, again, foster more growth, more development of not just your people, but the company and the company's initiatives as well.
So our listeners are in the world of training, right? And we want to give them ideas of how they can create more listening within the organization. And a lot of times it falls upon the training department either to coach people on how to better listen or to facilitate that process. What recommendations do you give to people in the training space for them to be the impetus of helping make this happen?
I think my number one recommendation is to make coaching widely available within your organization. Um, Coaching as a craft and a discipline is all about level three listening, or what we would call like some people would refer to that as active listening. But I would say level three listening even goes a level above that in terms of listening for the context that is not being spoken in a conversation. And when people experience conversations where they are themselves being coached, they're able to experience that type of listening. And that tends to be the easiest way for people to begin modeling that behavior elsewhere in their lives, especially with their direct reports, with their peers, and with their managers. So, as coaching professionals or as training professionals, we might think, oh, we're going to train people how to do something, but getting someone in a relationship where they can see that modeled frequently is probably the best way for knowledge transfer to happen when we're talking about how people engage in a conversation.
Just for the fun of it, why don't you go through the different levels of listening so people can kind of understand? Because, you know, to be honest with you, I've never heard of level three listening. So I
Okay.
will admit my naivety, but I think people would love to hear about this.
Sure. So, level one listening, you're probably familiar with. This is listening to respond, right?
Yeah.
So, this is when we're taking in information, but we are just waiting for when we can say what we think. We're waiting to get our 2 cents in,
I
right?
used to be really good at that.
How many of us operate in the world? Everyone wants to talk, no one wants to listen. So, oftentimes we're listening, waiting for when we get to speak again. So, that's level one. Level two is now what we would call more, I guess, traditional active listening. And this is where people are starting to read body language, facial expression, some of the nonverbal cues that come with verbal communication or with the ways that we engage. And level two is often where people will quote, Moravian with our 7% words, 38% tone of voice, and then 55% body language when we think about total communication. So that's level 2, incorporating those things into how we're reading and understanding people. And then level 3 listening takes into account all of those things at level 2, but also now looking for some of the things that are not said. So this might be shifts in emotion that you're witnessing in someone, right? So for example, someone might be speaking to you and then they take a big sigh, and then you actually take a pause to reflect and to acknowledge, hey, you took a big sigh right there. What's going on for you, right? So not just the intonation and the nonverbal communication, but also looking at what are the subtle shifts in energy that are occurring, how people are responding to their environment, and even what someone might be bringing into the current dialogue from a previous conversation that's not being said. And at level 3, we're able to bring all of that into the dialogue as part of what's being communicated in a conversation.
Is there such a thing as level 4?
I'm sure someone has come up with a level 4. I don't practice level 4 to my knowledge at this time, but there's always a new way of thinking about how we communicate. So I won't take it off the table.
It's interesting because my last guest was somebody that was revisiting the 7 habits from the Covey company.
Mm-hmm.
And, of course, one of their habits is listen to understand, not to respond,
Mm-hmm.
which, ties greatly into what you're saying. I have a theory on listening, which I'll share with you.
Yes.
I think it ties nicely into your level 3. It just may be a different way of saying it. But I like to listen for the nugget of truth. I like to listen to why someone is right. So a lot
Mm.
of times people listen because they want to hear them, but they're listening kind of defensively and they're kind of defending in their mind. They're literally listening to respond because they're listening to fight. But what I like to do is say, hey, I'm literally want to know how they're either all right or partly right because I want to build off something they're saying, truly to listen for the nugget of truth. And I just find that myself is a really good practice in improving my listening skills because when I was younger, I was a manipulative listener. There's no doubt about that. So this is maybe a little difficult question
Mm.
because I love your 3 levels of listening, and I can completely see how we can teach people to coach listening and listening skills and paraphrasing and all these good things. How do we evaluate the listening that happens within an organization?
Hmm. Well, so I think there's a couple of ways to look at this. So when I think about any engagement that I'm doing with teams or with an organization, I'm always thinking about, especially from the training perspective, what are we trying to solve for?
Yeah,
And so you're always looking at things like your engagement surveys and looking at how people are responding and how the employees are experiencing and reporting on the experience they're having in the workplace. When it comes to listening and thinking about how we're measuring listening, I think about whether or not folks feel heard. And that's a very common question when we look at engagement surveys is
sure.
asking things about the feedback culture, asking do people feel one, safe to contribute, safe to speak up, then also do they know what happens to their feedback after they give it? And so again, if we think about listening as not just to the words, but also to all the things that aren't being said, then the ways that we respond to listening are good indicators of whether or not people are being heard, right? Are
Yeah.
things being implemented? Are there actions being taken? Are policies changing? And those are things we can, again, if we're doing an engagement survey before a training initiative, we again are going to measure after, and then we can see, do people report being heard? Are they seeing changes happening? Do they have places where they can voice their concerns, their needs, et cetera? So I think a lot of that, and I think you might find maybe a lot of my answers to how do we know is we always ask the people and they'll tell us.
Well, that makes complete sense. Looking to supercharge your training? Let's talk about learning management systems. That's right, LMS. Don't have one? We should talk. Have an old one? We should talk. Have one not doing what you need? We should talk. At the Learning Network, we take LMS very seriously. In fact, we have 4 different options because not everyone's needs are the same. We have state-of-the-art features, and we can make your training experiences special, interesting, and exciting. So check us out at learning.net. Hey, by the way, we also have a lot of off the shelf content by ourselves or our partners, Open Sesame, amazing authoring tools, all kinds of reporting tools, everything you need to have your learning management system take your company to the next level of training. Come to learning.net today.
Yeah.
It really does, because especially if you ask repetitively, you can see trends and see if people are focusing. It's interesting. I went to the Gallup organization and really studied, they do a whole thing about engagement. And, basically they're saying the top quartile in engagement outbeats the bottom quartile. And this is a little old and they have new data, I'm sure, but they have a 3.8 times greater growth rate of profitability. I studied Net Promoter Score.
Mhm.
And I went and got by Samantha, I can't remember the name of the company. This is a long time ago. And I went down and I got certified in it.
Yeah.
And what was interesting is Net Promoter Score, which is asking the question, would you recommend? And they figure out a percentage of people are promoters versus detractors. But when you really get into it, if you do a Net Promoter Score of employees, that is the leading indicator of the customer Net Promoter Score. So a Net Promoter Score, in theory, is a leading indicator of the growth of the company. If a company has a good Net Promoter Score, which means people are recommending them a lot and not saying negative things, the company's going to see growth.
Mhm.
But if you want, and that's so it's a leading indicator of
Mhm.
business.
Mhm.
But if you want to lead that indicator, it's what do the employees think, which is back to your surveying of employees. Do they feel engaged? Do they feel heard? Would they recommend working in that company? Actually precedes the Net Promoter Score
Mhm.
as a result, validating everything you're saying.
Yeah. No, it makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense. And again, it goes back to kind of the original premise where we started this dialogue. When you get inclusion right, your company will thrive. It's really inevitable.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I
Mhm.
think you're totally right. So let me just ask the easy question. How do people start?
Well, again, the first place to start is to ask people. Get in there and
Yeah,
start asking
start with
questions.
a baseline.
Start with a baseline. You have to ask people what's their current experience. I was recently working with a client and they came to us, and as many folks do, and say, "Hey, we need a training. We heard you do some trainings. Can you do a training?" I said, "Well, what are you trying to solve for?" I said, "Oh, well, we did, a Google form. We sent a survey out to our team and we got these results back, and they were much more humbling than we were anticipating. We didn't know that people were feeling this way, or that, they had reports of people saying they couldn't speak their minds, or that they felt there was tone policing happening in the workplace, that people didn't really understand what they were dealing with." And I said, "Oh, that's fascinating." And so then we came in and we did a much more robust engagement survey. And then we also did focus groups and interviews. And all of that, when we think about the survey, that's anonymous. It's not going, back to their HR, which is very important for people. But you have to ask people and create a space where people can be honest about how they're experiencing things. What I have found is a lot of companies, a lot of team leaders think that they're doing much better than they actually are in terms of employee engagement and employee happiness. And that is largely because they either A, haven't asked people how they feel and how it's going, or B, they're not listening. And again, when I say not listening, we're talking listening at level 3, not just what they're saying, but all the things they're not saying are just as telling as well. And so if you want to get started, you have to first create an opportunity to get honest feedback about how it's going for employees and for people in the organization.
I love what you're saying, and I know how hard it is to get honest feedback. So I'm just going to add to something you said. You said it, but I want to make this clear to the audience. You're doing the surveying from a third party, and that's much more trusted than when the company does a survey internally, because there's always a question, is it truly anonymous? Will the feedback get back, or will the feedback not get back? Let me ask another question, because I think this one's interesting. What's your feeling on 360 surveys?
So I love a 360 tool. I also think we sometimes overcomplicate it and it becomes more clunky to get the data that we need from it. So I am a huge proponent that feedback should be happening at all levels of the organization to and from all levels of the organization. The way that you are with your direct reports is not the same as you are with your peers or the way that you are with your manager. And so getting feedback from all of those different reporting relationships is extremely valuable. At High Tides, we use the DISC 363 as our tool of choice. Very structured, gets anonymized feedback into the tool according to several relationships that you might have. And then that gives people an opportunity to see how they are self-assessing themselves in certain areas versus how folks in different demographics, right, in their employee experience are experiencing them. And then we get to play with those deltas, right, of the difference between your self-perception versus people who report to you versus the people you report to, et cetera. Extremely valuable data and often very humbling for people who participate in that to see where they perhaps have underestimated themselves, but also overestimated as well in terms of how well they might be doing in certain reporting relationships. I love a 360. I don't think you get more robust in terms of feedback than a 360.
I love a 362. And a lot of listeners don't know, but I used to manage a $5 billion company.
Hmm.
So the one thing I learned early on is there are people really good at sucking up or managing up. And not until you let them go do you hear that this person was just, you know, horrendous leader
Yeah.
because the way they worked with you and their openness and genuineness you assumed applied to everybody. The only thing I would add to your 360, and I don't think you disagree with this ad, is as the leader of the organization yourself, you have to have a 360 yourself.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. I didn't think you were going to disagree with me, but you know, if you're asking everyone else to, and you don't, that sets a really bad, what do you call it? Example. That's the word I'm
Yeah.
looking for.
Well, I agree. I think not only is it important, just as you've said, from a role modeling perspective, so that everyone's participating in a feedback process. But also, I have found the higher a leader is on the org chart, the less likely they're receiving consistent, honest
Yeah.
feedback. Right there, we cannot deny that some interesting things happen with power dynamics where people are not nearly as honest or forthcoming, especially with critique, as they may have been with you when you were lower on the org chart. So creating opportunity for people to give you feedback in a way where they feel safe and where it feels approachable to do so is tremendously valuable, not just by way of example, but also so that you're actually getting feedback, even when you're maybe at the top of where you could be in your career trajectory.
Yeah. Marie, you are clearly talented person, and I bet our listeners would love to know more about you and High Tide Consulting, who are your clients, how you work. So please tell us about what you do more literally and how people can reach you, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. So our my company is High Tides Consulting. We are a boutique learning and development company. So we really focus on bespoke training experiences.
You said bespoke.
Bespoke, yes.
What does
So
that mean?
so bespoke just means it's customized to the client experience,
Okay.
right? So we have a workshop or an experience catalog, topics that we cover across leadership and communication skills. But when a client comes to us, we're going to do a pretty thorough discovery and then modify and customize that experience to the client quite a bit. And so that's why we tend to work with smaller teams or smaller organizations, small to mid-sized companies, usually 20 to 5,000 people tends to be our sweet spot because we usually end up working with one team at a time within an organization to help them execute across a learning strategy. So sometimes that means they're integrating us into an existing leadership development program, and we provide the content and facilitation for it. Sometimes that means supporting with additional coaching support. So all of the practitioners on our team are trained professional coaches, which is, I think, something that we do probably different than others. But what that allows is for us to be really deep and really intentional around how we are modeling communication skills inside a learning experience and especially inside of a team.
I want to share something with our listeners because I think this is important to know about you.
Mm,
We're a TV show, So you can go to C-Suite TV or you can go to our YouTube channel, trainingunleashed.net. I gotta promote them. But 95% of the people are listening. You, Marie, speak with your face better than like just about anyone I have ever met. You can see the empathy, you can see the desire to hear, the desire to listen. I can tell when I'm talking, you're listening well. So if you and if your team is at all like you guys are really powerful coaches. So I just wanted to point that out to everybody.
Thank you for that, Evan. It's not often I get complimented for my face saying so much. So I appreciate that.
Well, it
Um,
does. It really does.
but to your point, I think it does speak to the things that we think are really important at high tides, which is there should be emotional connection at work. And that's
Yeah.
sometimes things that, people discount quite a bit, but a lot of what we're doing in communicating is trying to express an emotion, an idea to someone. And if we're honest, words are pretty poor excuses for the kinds of ideas that people have in their heads.
Yeah.
And so if we can create more spaces where people can communicate better, can use more of their full expression, can be heard at level 3 for all of the things that are sometimes difficult to say with words, I think magic gets to happen in that kind of space.
I think you guys should create a level 4.
Got my wheels turning, Evan. I might have a level 4 the next time I see you.
We'll do a special show on it.
Level 4.
So how to connect with you.
Oh,
Or you also have an offer, and I think people would be really interested in learning about your offer.
yes, yes. So I do have something special for our listeners today. And so you can find us at hightidesconsulting.co. And we'll provide a link for your audience, just a special link for those listening to Training Unleashed that'll take you to our Barrier and Bridges Behaviors Assessment. And this is a tool that we love using. It's a way for people to start looking at the workplace behaviors around inclusion, where they might have more opportunities to flex into or out of in order to create more inclusive workspaces.
So hightideconsulting.co. You said
Yes.
co, which I know is perfectly fine for CO, but people are listening, people are driving. I like to get that. So if they want to get access to the assessment, do they put like a / Training Unleashed? What do they do?
Exactly right. It's going to be hightidesconsulting.co/podcasts/training unleashed.
Okay. /podcast/ Training Unleashed. And
Yes.
as I know you haven't created this, maybe you could just make it /training, make it a little easier on everyone.
/training. Make it super easy for people to find. We can do that. We can do that.
Now I'm really confusing everyone. Okay. hightidesconsulting.co/podcast/training
Yes.
to get the assessment, which would be fantastic. It's a great offer. Marie, as you know, we always end the show with our guest sharing. If you had one tip to share, what would that one tip be? To me, this is one of the more fun parts of the show. So we're looking forward to hearing your tip.
I'm going to keep my tip short, and it's going to be listen more to yourself and to others.
Ooh, I like that. I like that. I think sometimes people don't listen to themselves.
I think a lot of times people don't listen to themselves, and that's what gets us in trouble.
Well, Marie, thank you on behalf of the Training Network. We really appreciate having you as a guest. To our listeners and watchers, we want to thank you too. And also thank our sponsors, C-Suite Radio and C-Suite TV. Remind everyone we have a great website, trainingunleashed.net. And if you go there, you can actually see the URL to get to the free offer, which is sometimes the easiest way. And of course, you can go to YouTube and subscribe to Training Unleashed Network. It's pretty new, so we don't have a lot of subscribers yet, but we're looking to really build up a community on YouTube. And everyone have a fantastic day.